Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, welcome back to the podcast. Richard, it's good to see you.
Good to be with you again, as always.
As always, yes. Well, it's good to be with our listeners again as well. Mm-hmm. We hope you've had a good week and been able to take your leadership to the next level. And this week we're on a bit of a downer, and it's talking about leaders who have fallen. And there seems to be an unusual high number of prominent Christian leaders who have fallen morally or otherwise lately, and it's kind of become a huge issue. Yeah. So why do you think that so many seemingly successful, together, respected, intelligent leaders fail so dramatically?
Well, Sam, there's always been those throughout history. It's not a new phenomenon, but now and then, for some reason, it just seems to be that there's a larger number of people. It just seems like the news is regularly telling about another person that has fallen, and a lot of the Christian circles that I run in lately, there's just been it seems like an unusual number of people that of highly respected people you would never expect to have this happen to them. And of course, the stories are all somewhat different, but the bottom line is often the same. Many of them, some level of adultery that they committed, and very effective people that have accomplished much, greatly respected, are suddenly resigning immediately, resigning all their posts, stopping to minister, leaving their jobs. And another person who had been very effective in the ministry is no longer serving. And so it's a devastating thing. Of course, in a day in which Christianity is under attack and there's such great need in our world that is seemingly becoming increasingly dark spiritually. Yeah. The last thing we need to do is to be losing good soldiers, good, effective communicators of the gospel. We can't afford to get those people sidelined. And of course, it's just a horrendous tragedy for that person, for their spouse, for their children, for people whose lives were impacted greatly by their ministry. Mm-hmm. It's always devastating when you became a Christian by someone sharing with you, walking with you, and then that person who led you to Christ and baptized you, maybe did your wedding, suddenly they are exposed as living immorally. Yeah. It often shakes your faith tremendously. And so it seems lately why we're doing this podcast is because just in recent days, there seems to be a heavy number of people that are falling. And so when I look at why they fall, a couple of things just to point out. First of all, is that we do tend to put people on pedestals. And so if someone is a great preacher, someone is a beloved pastor, we tend to assume, we kind of put a halo upon them and assume that everything that they do is done wisely and done well. And I've learned, I've been a minister, I've grown up in a minister's home. You can be a wonderful preacher and yet have some personal failings. And I'm not just talking about moral failings, but even great servants of God are not necessarily good at everything. Yeah. And so, for instance, there's a interesting story of A.W. Tozer. I love Tozer's work. I love his books. Love his preaching. Yeah. Powerful person. But he died eventually, and his wife married a businessman. And, of course, people were curious because her first husband was such a revered, highly respected Christian leader. And instead of marrying another preacher, she married a layperson. And so they asked him and said, well, what's it like comparing your two husbands? The one is famous and revered for his godliness and love for God, and the other, an unknown person, basically, good person, but just not famous and not a preacher. And Tozer's wife said an interesting thing. She said, well, with A.W. Tozer, I had no doubt that he loved God. And she said, with my current husband, I have no doubt that he loves me. Wow. And I thought that was very telling. I don't know that means they had a bad marriage, but it just means that he was so focused on God that he neglected his wife. His wife did not always feel loved. She felt definitely in second place. And maybe it's okay to feel second place to God, but sometimes we confuse God in the church, or we confuse God in ministry.
Yeah.
And we assume that anything involving ministry is the same as God.
You know, it seems that a lot of times, especially Christian leaders, they tend to do like one thing extremely well
Yeah.
to the neglect of almost every other aspect.
Right.
Of
You know,
life.
another great example is William Carey, that was the father of Baptist foreign missions, who felt called. Of course, he preached the great sermon, ask great things of God, expect great things from God, and he ultimately goes to India. But his wife just was not consumed with missions the way he was. She wasn't cut out really to go live in the really difficult environment of India at that time, and so he was going to go without her. He was setting sail without his wife to go all the way to India to do mission work, and the boat was delayed. The departure time was put off for a day or so, and so people came and pled with his wife, don't stay behind. So she, at the very last moment, packs up her bags, goes down to the boat, and joins her husband going to India. Well, she basically lost her mind over there and was all but put into a padded room so she wouldn't hurt herself. Lost her mind, went crazy in India. It was just too much for her.
Yeah.
And so we celebrate William Carey as a great missionary pioneer and motivator. But there was a price to pay. And again, it's not that he was necessarily immoral or adulterous, but some of these one of the great questions about great leaders is, in order to do great things, do you have to neglect other important things?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes leaders, they struggle in that area, and sometimes they neglect things to their peril. They do neglect their marriage. They neglect their own self-care. Some leaders, for instance, if they're pastors, maybe they focus so much on preaching that they neglect their health. They put on a lot of weight. They don't exercise. They don't eat well. Or they just don't. They're so busy giving other people a word from God that they neglect feeding their own soul, and they become spiritually dry, and their walk with God becomes very cold, and they're just going through the motions. And I see that often, and that's why we're real surprised when a guy who preaches so much to others, and then you find out that there's a huge void in their own life.
Yeah.
That their own marriage has been in great stress for a long time. And you think, well, how could this be? They travel the world encouraging other people's walk with God. How could they have been so out of touch with God's voice themselves? And yet that's one of the great dangers of leadership, is that we focus so much on getting other people where they should be that we neglect to make sure we are where we should be as well.
Yeah. Well, so what advice do you have
Well,
for people in that situation?
Well, you know, you've got to be aware of what's happening in your life. And number one, you have to guard your own heart. And no one else will guard your heart for you. You've got to just make that a priority to say, has my love for God run cold? Has my love for my spouse gone cold? And what happens for a lot of leaders like this is that especially when they've been very successful, whether you're a secular leader or a Christian leader, is you start to think that the rules don't necessarily apply to you. If you, for instance, started a church and it's grown to several thousand people, or you started a company, or you turned the company around and made it successful, you begin to think, well, this company or this organization owes a lot to me. It wouldn't be here. It wouldn't be this great. It wouldn't be this profitable if it wasn't for me. And that's why sometimes CEOs will dip into company funds, and they'll say, well, the company wouldn't have all this money if it wasn't for me. And
somehow they deserve it.
I pulled this great deal, I made this great sale, and now we've got all this money coming in, so it owes me this $10,000 shower curtain or whatever it is that's ridiculous. I've seen for a lot of people, especially with pastors, when they commit adultery or they embezzle funds, you think to yourself, how on earth would they have thought they would not have been found out? How could they think they could get away with that? What were they thinking? In fact, there's an interesting book that was edited by Robert Sternberg. It's called Why Smart People Can Be So Stupid. That title caught my attention. I had to read that one. when I first saw it. And it's a secular book, but it looks at for instance, one of the examples is Bill Clinton, who's a Rhodes Scholar, is obviously a smart man in many ways, and yet he could be having an affair with an intern in the Oval Office. And you'd say, well, how could a guy who academically, politically is that smart, how could he do something so foolish, so reckless, that could just endanger his entire presidency? And so this book kind of looks at that to say, why do people as leaders who are so smart think that they can get away with stuff that is going to bring them down and cause their reputation to be lost and so on? And oftentimes it's because they think that it just can't happen to them, that somehow they're above the rules, or people owe them so much that they're exempt. They would never encourage someone else to do those kind of things, but somehow they think they're immune from it, or they deserve it. Or oftentimes I've seen people that fall, that what happens is they get tired, they get careless, they let their guard down. Sometimes it's just a one-night kind of mistake or failure, but they get caught in a weak moment. They're not on their guard all the time. Oftentimes when people travel a lot, they're away from home. They're getting back late at night at their hotel room or whatever, and they've allowed themselves to get into a vulnerable position. And so they oftentimes do things that they know are wrong. They know that they shouldn't do, and they've urged lots of other people. In fact, most of the people I know who fail morally, especially pastors, it's never out of ignorance. It's never that they didn't know they shouldn't do that. Yeah. In fact, they've all preached and urged others not to do that. But in a weak moment, we suddenly think that somehow it doesn't matter for me, or I can get away with that, or I'll just do this one time, and I'll just borrow company funds one time, and then the next thing you know, you've embezzled $300,000, and you're being found out, and now you're headed to jail. And people would say, well, how could you have done something so foolish? You had this great ministry. How could you have thought you wouldn't have been caught and exposed? We delude ourselves. We create our own reality, and we find a way to justify what we're doing so that it makes perfect sense to us when we're explaining it to ourselves. But when it's exposed, suddenly it appears just as foolish as it's always been.
Yeah, I think the danger is to believe in that pedestal that you're put on as a leader, that you're somehow not human in a way.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a quick break here, and we'll jump back into this.
Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. If this sounds like something you're interested in, the next workshop dates are October 24th to 26th, and registration is open now. The early bird rate is available until September 30th, and space is limited. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. We'll also leave links in the show notes.
So, Richard, what are some red flags that we can be looking at leaders, and then as a leader, what are some red flags that we should be paying attention to that might indicate that we're vulnerable of failing?
That's a great question. A lot of times when someone does fail, then people come out of the woodwork and say, well, I was concerned because I had noticed this, or for several months I'd seen this. But of course, when you're a revered leader and you see those red flags, you just assume, well, that would never happen to them. Or who am I to suggest to the boss that they've got a problem here? And I've just learned to take red flags seriously. So if it's I'm looking at myself, if I find that my own walk with God has grown stale, that ought to be a huge red flag. I'm vulnerable. If I'm going around telling other people about how to be right with God, but I've neglected my own quiet time. My own prayer life is stale. Red lights ought to be flashing on the warning dash right there. For a lot of leaders, I see that when they get tired, when you're tired, you're vulnerable.
Yeah.
And when you have been going too hard, too long, you're at a very you need to understand how vulnerable you are. And if I see someone who's very tired, maybe even working for me, I may want to encourage them, hey, just get some rest, take care of yourself right now, because our attitudes change. Our thinking gets cloudy. We start rationalizing things when we're tired. That with a clear mind, we know how much nonsense that was. When I'm watching people, I can detect things. For instance, I've known some men that were huggers, and they were especially hugging females. And I'll tell you what, in this culture, you're asking for trouble. And when you're just kind of touching female, it might be just patting them on the back or just touching them, but there are people that I've just noticed who have a habit of doing that, and then lo and behold, that touching is really a reflection of more going on, and it's opening the door for more to happen. I find that too, especially with men that have engaged in sexual humor. I knew a person one time that he was always making just edgy kind of jokes. He was a Christian, but he would tell jokes that I just didn't think were appropriate for a Christian to tell. They were just a lot of sexual overtones. And at the time, you thought, well, that guy just has a little off-color sort of sense of humor. But the Bible says what comes out of your mouth reflects what's in your heart.
Yeah.
And that person ultimately did fall morally. And you realize, well, all that stuff coming out of his mouth was just indicating where his mind was, where his thoughts were. And you think, well, how far can I go with someone who just told a bit of an off-color joke? I mean, I didn't laugh at the joke. I didn't encourage it. I tried to let him know I disapproved of that kind of humor, but maybe I should have said something about, wow, why is it you talk so much about that? Why do you think so much about that?
Yeah.
And so there's one other thing is just when I see someone that is beginning to isolate themselves. Pretty well, when studies have been done of especially pastors and Christian leaders who've fallen morally, the one common denominator typically is that they had no one to whom they were accountable. They were maybe the pastor of a megachurch, and none of their staff dared point out the fact that they had off-color jokes, or they liked to hug women, or they spent a lot of time alone in their office with their secretary, or whatever it might be. And they don't have any accountability group. There's no prayer partner. There's no person that asks them hard questions. They don't come to the pastor's meetings anymore. When I see someone isolating themselves, who doesn't have time to get with other peers, people that have the authority or the opportunity to ask hard questions, usually when we're doing something we shouldn't, we don't want to be around people that can ask us hard questions.
Yeah.
And so the moment I find someone who's not wanting to be in that kind of context, doesn't want to be held accountable, who thinks they're above that, they're in danger. They're vulnerable.
Well, the importance of being close to your peer group. I think that you're with people. You're not always around people that look up to you, maybe.
Right.
That you're around people who are on the same level.
And there's a lot of leaders who just want to have sycophants around them that just praise them all the time and never question them. Just always tell them how great they are. And again, you're making yourself extremely vulnerable if that's all you have around you.
Yeah. So we've looked at some of these red flags, and so just the natural next question is: so how do we protect against some of these potential pitfalls?
Maybe two things just to say. One is certainly from a moral perspective, jealously guard your walk with God and your relationship with your spouse.
Yeah.
If your relationship with your spouse is not what it ought to be, you're in charge of, you're a leader, make it so. Don't just resign yourself to the fact, okay, I'm going to have an unloving, unhealthy marital relationship. That leaves you incredibly vulnerable to someone of the opposite sex coming into your life and meeting a need that your wife should or your husband should be meeting.
Right.
So be guarding yourself that way. And then I think I think Billy Graham and his organization decades ago had a Modesto manifesto that where they just came up with some rules about things like I'll never be alone with someone of the opposite sex. And kind of famously here recently, Mike Pence, the vice president, came out that he has those rules. He doesn't meet one-on-one with a female. And of course, a lot of the press mocked him for that, which is so typical of the world. They'd also be very quick to be reporting if there was ever a moral scandal that he had. Mm-hmm. But he had built some things, and of course they made it all sound like, well, he just thinks all women are connivers and seductresses. And he was saying, no, I'm I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if I'm never alone with a female, it's pretty hard to develop an unhealthy relationship. And
Yeah.
what he was saying is, I know myself. I know I'm a vulnerable, sinful person. And so I'm going to build safeguards into my routine. So even if I am tired, and even if I am not in the best space, my routines and my schedule prevents me from falling. And I think that that's wise. I think that's why leaders often put windows in their office doors so that they can't be just shielded entirely from any kind of scrutiny when they're in their office with someone of the opposite sex. And there's a number of rules. I think you have to kind of prayerfully just consider what your routines and schedules should be. I don't know that you have to just copy what everyone else does.
Sure.
But I think you need to be intentional about it. And I think you need to, if you think ahead of time, what are things I won't do? I won't meet with someone of the opposite sex in my hotel room when I'm traveling. There's been some recent scandals coming out that way of prominent leaders that would have meetings in their hotel room. Well, that's just sort of a given that you're just playing with fire if you're going to do that. And so to think ahead of time and say, well, if someone offers that, if someone says, well, hey, why don't I just come up to your room and we'll work on this? You have a policy already that says, well, I just don't do that. But if you don't have any policies, you haven't guarded yourself ahead of time, then in the moment, you may just make a foolish mistake just because you haven't prepared yourself. So I would say in this day and age in which we live, and there are people that, and there is evil out there, I think, that would happily bring down Christian leaders. And so you do need to be careful of that. And there are people who might accuse you, even if nothing at all had happened. You'd be vulnerable just to an accusation. And so in this day in which we live and lead, you just have to take the highest road possible and take the most precautions because there's just too many ways where things could go wrong or at least appear to have gone wrong.
And so I guess the big question that I think we'll end with is, what difference does it really make? I mean, obviously in the church, it makes a difference if someone has a moral failing. Just say in business, does it make a difference if the leader is has failed morally as long as they're leading well?
Well, and that's a huge debate. And I think it is probably important to look at both spiritual leaders, Christian leaders, and in a Christian context and a secular leader. A lot of American presidents, like a JFK or a Bill Clinton, they accomplished some good things as president, but they also clearly had some moral failures. Martin Luther King Jr. had moral failures, even though he accomplished much good and did much that was, I think, very God-honoring. And that is very confusing to people to say, well, so do you just rule out everything they did? Do you just say, we can't celebrate any of that person's contributions because we happen to know that they were an adulterer? And my feeling is you have to pretty well measure a leader's contribution on its own merits and to say, well, they did accomplish these things. You can't take that away from them. They did accomplish good. But at the same time, their personal life, they failed in some huge areas. And of course, the big debate is, can you trust someone? If you would regularly barefaced lie to your spouse about where you're going and betray her and betray a promise you made before God and witnesses and lie to your children, then could you be trusted to tell the truth at work?
Yeah.
Can you be trusted to tell the truth to peers and employees and supervisors if you've lied to the people that trust and love you the most? If you'd betray them, who wouldn't you betray? Of course, is a big issue. And certainly when you serve God, our goal is not so much to get things done as it is to bring glory to God.
Yeah.
And so if you're failing to bring glory to God, you're failing as a leader. And I think certainly a pastor, is more than perhaps anyone else, is a role model. And so when you fail morally, you undercut the faith, the belief, the convictions, the moral standards of all kinds of other people. And if someone else is considering adultery, if someone else is considering some kind of moral breach, and then they see that, well, their spiritual leader has done that in the past or recently did that, Some people are just looking for an excuse.
Yeah.
And I think that's why there's lots of places in the Bible that talks about being blameless, because being blameless in part means you don't provide anyone else with an excuse for doing the same things.
Yeah.
They can't point to you and say, well, he did it, she did it, so it's okay for me to do it. And I think especially in spiritual leadership roles, pastor roles and so on, there is a higher standard.
Yeah.
And whether you think that's fair or not, there just is a higher standard because people look to us as a model, and we don't want to be a cause of stumbling. I think Jesus said there's some huge repercussions and consequences for causing others to stumble. And so it does matter what our character is like. It does matter what our moral life is like. And I do think that when people do fail, it's the right thing to do is to step out of leadership and to say, I've just disqualified myself at this point. And it needs to be clear that when you do this kind of behavior, you're no longer qualified to lead.
Yeah, and I think 1 Timothy chapter 3 is a great reminder for anyone in leadership of how you ought to act and just sort of hold that up as a checklist to yourself every so often and say, am I living up to what the Bible puts out as a leader?
Yeah.
And I know it's talking about pastors, but I think that, I think those are great things for anyone to live by, and especially anyone in leadership.
You'll never go wrong by trying to meet the Bible standards, and just never say it could never happen to me. Don't ever. I think that's one of the greatest vulnerabilities is to say I'm just not that kind of person. It could never happen to me.
Yeah.
And what history has shown is, I think pretty well certainly the prominent Christian leaders that I have known that have recently fallen, not one of them would have ever thought that it could happen to them. And people around them would never have thought that. But given the right opportunity, the right context, the right frame of mind, the right level of weariness and isolation, given the right context, it just goes to show we're all vulnerable. Yeah. And so we need to assume that, and we need to put protections around ourselves so that should we ever get to that place, we'll still have enough safeguards in place to keep us from making a really bad mistake.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.